The morning sun bathed the grand marble facade of the downtown bank in a warm glow, its golden rays reflecting the institution's stature and history. Inside, the bank was already bustling with activity. Mr. Richard Holmes, the manager, sat in his glass-walled office, overlooking the pristine lobby. His tailored suit and immaculate desk spoke volumes about his meticulous nature and his belief in absolute authority within the walls of this financial sanctuary. For him, each day was a stage, and he was the star performer, commanding respect and control from both clients and employees alike. But today would be different. The air shifted subtly when she entered. Tall, poised, and commanding attention without uttering a single word, the woman was a presence unlike any other. Her tailored business suit accentuated her authority, and her leather briefcase hinted at power and precision. Conversations quieted, and heads turned as she made her way to the counter. "Good morning," she greeted the young cashier, her voice smooth and assured. "I'd like to deposit this check into my account." The cashier, a young woman named Sophie, blinked as her eyes fell on the check. It was a staggering six-figure sum. She composed herself quickly, though her hands trembled slightly as she held the document. "Of course, ma'am," she said, forcing professionalism into her tone. "I'll need to direct you to our manager for this transaction." The woman nodded, unfazed, her confidence unwavering. Sophie gestured toward Richard's office, her heart racing as she stepped inside to announce the unusual transaction. "Mr. Holmes," Sophie began, her voice hesitant, "there's a client here with a substantial check. I think you should handle this personally." Richard barely looked up from his desk, his eyes scanning Sophie with mild irritation before finally turning to the client standing at his door. His expression stiffened. Years of experience told him she was not the typical customer for this branch. He masked his unease with a facade of cold professionalism. "How can I assist you?" he asked curtly, motioning for her to step inside, though his tone betrayed a subtle lack of warmth. "I'm here to deposit this check into my account," she replied evenly, placing the document on his desk with the practiced ease of someone who had navigated high-stakes environments before. Richard picked up the check, his brows furrowing as he examined it. The sum was indeed extraordinary, but something else made him pause, an unspoken bias that colored his perception. His lips thinned as suspicion crept into his voice. "This is quite a large amount," he said, his tone sharp. "I'll need to verify the source of these funds." "It's standard procedure." The woman's composure remained intact. "All the necessary documentation is provided," she replied calmly. "You're welcome to contact my legal team for any further clarifications." Richard leaned back in his chair, his demeanor growing increasingly rigid. "Even so, I'll require additional verification," he said, his voice laced with an unspoken challenge. "Perhaps you could provide evidence of your business's legitimacy." The woman's brows arched slightly, but she did not falter. "My business complies fully with the law," she stated firmly. "You already have everything you need to process this transaction without delay." The tension in the room was palpable, drawing the attention of several employees who peeked from their desks. Sensing the escalating confrontation, Sophie hesitated before stepping forward again. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, "I've seen this client before. She's conducted significant transactions with us in the past. Her account is in excellent standing." Richard shot her a glare that silenced any further protest. "You're dismissed, Sophie," he snapped. Then, turning back to the client, he said in a clipped tone, "If you have a problem, you're free to file a complaint. However, I reserve the right to investigate any check I deem suspicious." The woman sighed softly, her patience clearly being tested. "Very well," she said, retrieving her phone from her briefcase. "If you can't process this transaction, I'll escalate the matter to your leadership team. I'm certain they'll be interested in your approach." Richard's confidence faltered slightly as she dialed. His voice turned defensive, an edge of desperation creeping in. "Whoever you're calling will tell you the same thing," he said. "Verification is mandatory, and I can't bend the rules." Before he could continue, the door to his office swung open. In walked Catherine Lewis, the bank's regional director, her tailored suit and commanding presence cutting through the tension like a blade. Her sharp gaze took in the scene, lingering on the client before landing on Richard. "What's going on here?" Catherine demanded, her voice a mixture of authority and irritation. Richard stood, visibly flustered. "Catherine," he began, his voice faltering, "this client presented a large check, and I was simply following protocol." "A check?" Catherine's sharp eyes shifted to the client, and her stern expression softened immediately. "Mrs. Harper," she said, her tone now warm and apologetic, "my sincerest apologies. Is there an issue with your transaction?" The woman, now identified as Mrs. Harper, remained composed but firm. "It seems Mr. Holmes believes my check requires extra scrutiny. Apparently, his concerns go beyond protocol." Catherine's eyes narrowed as the implications sank in. Turning to Richard, her tone turned icy. "You do realize who Mrs. Harper is, don't you?" Richard stammered, his usual confidence crumbling. "Of course, but I was only trying to—" "That's enough," Catherine cut him off, her voice slicing through his excuses. Turning back to Mrs. Harper, she said, "Your transaction will be processed immediately. Please, wait in the lounge while I handle this personally." Mrs. Harper nodded, her gaze briefly meeting Richard's. In that fleeting moment, her expression conveyed a quiet but powerful message. This wasn't over. As she exited, Catherine turned back to Richard, her voice low but brimming with authority. "You just made a serious mistake, Richard, one that will not go unnoticed." Richard swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time, he realized the magnitude of what he had done. As Mrs. Harper calmly exited to the lounge, Catherine Lewis remained behind in Richard's office, her sharp gaze fixed on the shaken branch manager. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. Richard sat stiffly in his chair, beads of sweat forming on his forehead as he avoided Catherine's piercing glare. "You have no idea what you've just done, do you?" Catherine began, her tone cold and deliberate. Richard opened his mouth to respond but quickly shut it again. No excuse seemed sufficient to defend his actions. Catherine continued, her voice gaining an edge. "Mrs. Harper isn't just any client. She's one of this bank's largest shareholders, an individual with the power to make decisions that could end your career in a heartbeat. And yet, you chose to treat her with suspicion and disrespect. Why?" Richard's face turned pale. "I was just following protocol," he stammered. "The amount was unusual, and I thought it warranted further verification." "Don't insult my intelligence," Catherine snapped, leaning forward on the desk. "This wasn't about the amount, was it? This was about your own biases, your own assumptions. Do you treat every client with such scrutiny, or just the ones you deem unworthy?" Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confidence crumbling under Catherine's unrelenting gaze. Meanwhile, in the lounge, Mrs. Harper sat gracefully, reviewing some documents on her phone. Her composure was unshaken, but her eyes carried a steely resolve. She had faced challenges like this before, instances where her competence, legitimacy, or very presence was questioned. But she wasn't the type to let such treatment slide. A soft knock interrupted her focus. Sophie, the young cashier, stood at the entrance with a glass of water and a folder. Her nervousness was evident, but so was her determination. "Mrs. Harper," Sophie said hesitantly, "I wanted to bring you this and to thank you for your patience. I also wanted to say, I'm sorry for how this situation has been handled. You didn't deserve that." Mrs. Harper looked up and offered a warm, reassuring smile. "Thank you, Sophie. It means a lot to hear that. And I noticed your effort earlier. You tried to intervene, didn't you?" Sophie nodded, her cheeks flushing slightly. I thought it was unfair. You've always been a valued client here. I didn't want you to feel otherwise." Mrs. Harper's smile deepened. "That took courage. Don't lose that. This bank needs more people like you." As Sophie left the lounge, her spirits lifted by Mrs. Harper's words, Mrs. Harper returned to her phone. Her fingers moved deftly across the screen as she dialed a number. When the call connected, her voice was calm but firm. "Janet, it's Eleanor Harper," she began, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I need you to assemble the bank's leadership team immediately. We're going to address some serious issues that have come to light at one of our branches." "Yes," It's urgent. I want this resolved today." Back in Richard's office, Catherine was finishing her reprimand. "This isn't just about Mrs. Harper," she said, her voice quieter but no less intense. "It's about what your actions say about this branch and this bank as a whole. If our clients can't trust us to treat them with respect, then what do we stand for?" Richard, still visibly shaken, nodded weakly. "I understand," he muttered. "No," Catherine said sharply. "I don't think you do. But you will." Moments later, Catherine rejoined Mrs. Harper in the lounge, her demeanor softening as she approached. "Mrs. Harper," she said apologetically, "everything has been processed. Please accept my deepest apologies for the way you were treated. This matter will be addressed, I assure you." Eleanor stood, her presence commanding as ever. "Thank you, Catherine," she said, her voice steady. "But this goes beyond an apology. This is about the culture of your branches, the attitudes of your managers. It needs to change." "It will," Catherine promised, her tone resolute. Eleanor nodded, her gaze lingering briefly on Richard's office before she exited the building. As she walked through the lobby, staff and clients alike watched her with a mixture of respect and awe. She was more than just a powerful client. She was a force for accountability and change. Richard, still seated in his office, stared out the window, his mind racing. The weight of his actions pressed heavily on him. He had underestimated Mrs. Harper, dismissed her based on assumptions, and now he faced the consequences. Later that evening, in the sleek conference room of the bank's headquarters, Eleanor Harper sat at the head of the table. Surrounding her were the bank's top executives, including Catherine and a visibly subdued Richard. Eleanor began the meeting with calm authority. Yesterday's incident at the downtown branch was not just an error. It was a reflection of systemic issues that I can no longer ignore. As the largest shareholder in this bank, I have a responsibility to ensure that incidents like this never happen again. Her gaze swept across the room, pausing briefly on Richard, who avoided eye contact. "Catherine," Eleanor continued, "you've always been a professional, and I trust your commitment to this institution. But it's your responsibility to ensure that all branches operate with integrity, respect, and fairness. What happened yesterday was unacceptable." Catherine nodded solemnly. "I understand, Mrs. Harper. It won't happen again." Eleanor turned her attention to Richard, her expression unyielding. "As for you, Mr. Holmes, your actions have made it clear that you cannot remain in your position. You have two options: resign with a letter of recommendation or face an internal investigation. Either way, your time here is over." Richard's face turned ashen. He opened his mouth to protest but quickly closed it again, realizing the futility of arguing. Satisfied, Eleanor addressed the rest of the room. "This isn't just about one manager. This is about creating a culture that values inclusion, respect, and fairness. Effective immediately, I'm implementing the following changes." She placed a folder on the table, outlining her proposals. First, mandatory training for all staff on inclusivity and cultural competence. Second, a comprehensive review of our policies to eliminate bias. Third, the creation of an internal mechanism for clients and employees to report incidents like this. These changes will be implemented within the next month. The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement. Catherine spoke up first. "These changes are necessary. We cannot allow incidents like this to damage our reputation or our values." Eleanor nodded, her resolve unwavering. "This bank has a legacy to uphold, and I won't let anyone tarnish it. Not on my watch." The morning after the tense incident at the downtown branch, Eleanor Harper sat at the head of a sleek, glass conference table in the bank's sprawling headquarters. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the serious expressions of the leadership team seated before her. Each member felt the weight of the moment, understanding that the meeting wasn't just about yesterday's events, but about the very principles on which the institution operated. Eleanor's gaze swept across the room, her commanding presence silencing even the faintest whisper. Catherine Lewis sat to her left, composed yet visibly tense. Richard Holmes, on the other hand, appeared diminished, his confidence replaced by unease. Eleanor began, her voice calm but unyielding. Yesterday's incident at the downtown branch was not just an isolated mistake. It was a symptom of a larger, systemic issue. one that threatens the integrity of this institution. Let me be clear. This bank was built on trust, respect, and inclusivity. If we lose those values, we lose everything. Her words hung heavy in the air as she continued. What happened yesterday was unacceptable. A valued client, someone who has not only trusted this bank but invested in it, was treated with suspicion and disrespect. And why? Because of assumptions, biases, and a failure to uphold the standards we claim to stand for. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face pale. "Mrs. Harper," he began hesitantly, "I deeply regret what happened. I misjudged the situation, but my intention was never—" Eleanor raised a hand, silencing him. "Mr. Holmes, this is not about your intentions. This is about your actions. You let your biases cloud your judgment. You ignored the documentation presented to you. And worst of all, you disrespected a client who deserved your professionalism and courtesy. Intentions don't erase the harm caused." Richard looked down, unable to meet Eleanor's piercing gaze. Eleanor turned to the rest of the leadership team. "This is not just about one person's error. It's about the culture we've allowed to fester. That's why immediate action is necessary." She placed a stack of documents on the table and gestured toward them. "These are the changes I am implementing," she said firmly. "First, mandatory training for all employees on inclusivity, cultural competence, and ethical practices. Second, a comprehensive review of our internal procedures to identify and eliminate biases. And third, the establishment of an internal accountability mechanism, a clear, accessible process for employees and clients to report concerns without fear of retaliation." Murmurs spread across the room, some of concern and others of agreement. Catherine was the first to speak. "These changes are necessary, Mrs. Harper. We cannot afford to let incidents like this jeopardize our reputation or our commitment to our clients." Eleanor nodded. "Exactly. This bank is more than just a financial institution. It's a symbol of trust. We serve a diverse clientele, and we must reflect that diversity in our attitudes and practices. If we fail to do so, we fail our clients and ourselves." She turned her attention back to Richard. "Mr. Holmes, your actions have shown that you are not fit to continue in your role. Effective immediately, you are to step down as branch manager. You have two options: resign with a letter of recommendation or face a formal investigation. I strongly advise you to choose wisely." Richard's face turned ashen. He opened his mouth to protest but quickly closed it, realizing the futility of arguing. His career at the bank was effectively over, and he knew it. Satisfied, Eleanor addressed the rest of the team. "I expect full cooperation in implementing these changes. This is not optional. We owe it to our clients, our employees, and ourselves to be better." With the meeting adjourned, Eleanor returned to the downtown branch later that afternoon. The atmosphere was noticeably subdued, the staff still reeling from the events of the previous day. As she entered, all eyes turned to her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, respect, and a hint of fear. Sophie, the young cashier who had tried to intervene the day before, hesitated before stepping forward. "Mrs. Harper," she said softly, "it's good to see you again. I just wanted to say thank you for addressing what happened. And I'm sorry you had to go through that." Eleanor's expression softened, and she smiled warmly. "Thank you, Sophie. But I should be thanking you. You showed courage yesterday, standing up for what you believed was right. That's not easy, especially in situations like these." Sophie blushed, her eyes widening in surprise. I couldn't stay silent. It wasn't fair." Eleanor placed a reassuring hand on Sophie's shoulder. "And that's exactly the kind of integrity this bank needs. If you ever consider advancing your career, reach out to me. I'd be happy to support you." Sophie's face lit up with a mixture of pride and disbelief. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper. That means so much." As Eleanor walked through the branch, she could feel the shift in the air. Staff members who had been hesitant to meet her gaze now watched her with a sense of admiration. She wasn't just a powerful figure in the financial world. She was a leader who stood up for what was right. In her office later that evening, Eleanor reflected on the day's events. The steps she had taken were just the beginning. True change would take time, effort, and a commitment from every level of the organization. But as she thought about Sophie's courage and Catherine's support, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about fixing one incident. It was about building a better, more inclusive institution. And Eleanor Harper was determined to see it through.